Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to IISS. My name is Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director for Future Conflict and Cyber Security here at the Institute, and I shall be chairing this session, which is going to be in its totality on the record. The topic is one that is intensely topical, and our speaker this evening, I think, is almost uniquely qualified to talk to it. I don't think he really needs much in the way of introduction. Indeed, if any of you don't know who he is, then there's a very strong probability that you've somehow come to the wrong meeting. But David Kilcullen, formerly Colonel in the Australian Army, specialising in counter-insurgency, and I remember, David, from I think it was the Accidental Guerrilla, you made the rueful observation that you actually had to leave the army to get into the fight. I first came across David, I think, talking at Shrivenham when Iraq was really going horribly wrong. He then joined David Petraeus's team on the Iraq surge operation, and he has been studying and writing about issues of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency ever since. His books include The Accidental Guerrilla, the Out of the Mountains, and his most recent publication, for which I think there are flyers available, Blood Year, which looks at the rise of Islamic State and the wider strategic implications that come from that. David and I are going to conduct a moderated discussion for maybe half an hour, following which I will open the floor for questions and comments. If you do have something to say or to ask, I would ask only that you tell me who you are before you speak. So, without further ado, because you come to hear David and not me, I'll start the conversation.
Sure.
And David, perhaps I could ask you to start by spending a few minutes just setting out your evaluation of what the current global jihadist threat is. Where are we now, and how did we get here?
Yeah. So this is a huge question. And let me say, first of all, thanks to everybody for coming out. I know you probably have other places to be on a Monday night in London, so I appreciate you spending an hour or so with us. As I say in the book, I think we now find ourselves in a more dangerous situation than at any time since 9/11. And moreover, we're in a more fragmented, much more dangerous regional environment in the Middle East, and we've seen a very significant spread of the threat through about 80 countries now. We're dealing with not one but two major global jihadist threats, plus what amounts to a conventional warfare threat in the Middle East. So I sort of break it down into three levels, and I think it's worth just mentioning these in some detail. First one is this, what I would call a state-like entity or a pseudo-state that's currently occupying about a third of Iraq and a third of Syria. 6 million people under its control. As of last week, 10 major cities and several minor cities. It has an annual revenue that puts it probably at the top of the tree for any terrorist group in history, with the exception of the FARC at the height of the drug war in the late 90s. And it thinks it's a state, it tries to govern like a state, it fights like a state, and in many ways, in fact, it meets the requirements under international law to be considered as a state. I'm not suggesting we're going to recognize it as a state, but what that suggests to you is that the kind of threat that the central element of the Islamic State poses is much more geopolitical and much more sort of conventional warfare, destabilizing the Middle East, knock-on effect into Afghanistan and Pakistan and Africa and Europe, than a traditional terrorism threat. So that's the sort of first layer of the threat. Second is what ISIS calls the wilayat, the regional territories or provinces of the Islamic State, which are now in 11 countries. They've conducted attacks in 79 other countries. And I think we're going to see a new IS wilayat emerge in Southeast Asia very soon. And that's much more like a traditional regional terrorism or insurgency threat. And so it's destabilizing of countries that already have other problems, and it's creating not only a significant spike in terrorism in the countries where we see ISIS wilayats, but it's prompting a secondary set of effects, including massive population displacement. 1.1 million refugees into Europe in 2016. EU projects another 3 million by the end of 2017. So significant, indirect effect as a result of that. The third layer is what I call the international, and I'm deliberately referring back here to an earlier era of international terrorism, where something like 200,000 people, it's very hard to know exactly how many, but Twitter a couple of weeks ago suspended what it considered to be a number of ISIS-linked Twitter accounts in the amount of 125,000 globally. So let's say that one Twitter account doesn't necessarily reflect one person, but I think we're still looking at a pretty substantial number of people. And this is a very atomized, individuals, small cells, ad hoc groupings, a sort of atomized structure that's carrying out propaganda, it's carrying out subversion, and it's carrying out terrorism, but in a different way than what we saw with Al-Qaeda. So much more sort of urban siege, leaderless resistance, mobile active shooter type scenarios, rather than the kinds of plots that are planned months in advance and involve dozens of people. And of course, as you all know, it doesn't, just because a plot is smaller and more ad hoc doesn't mean that it takes less resources from the security services or from the state to surveil and monitor that. So, that's how I see the threat. And it's much broader than just a terrorist threat. And it's happening, of course, in an environment where we still have Al-Qaeda and we still have a number of other regional conflicts going on. And so, as I say, I think we're in a worse situation than we've been since the beginning of the war on terror.
Yes, and from a geopolitical perspective, of course, this has opened up a whole lot of new and increasingly complex fronts, so to speak, almost epitomizing the definition of a wicked problem. I mean, can you say something about the sort of the sort of geopolitics?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean,
what you see here is an environment where anything we do to further our actions in one part of the problem will tend to have a negative effect somewhere else. So think about the Kurds, who are currently, being treated like a state in terms of provision of weapons and support. They are not as unified as they used to be after the end of Barzani's term last August. There's actually some significant conflicts between the PUK and the KDP in Iraqi Kurdistan. You then have a whole Kurdish group in northeastern Syria, in Hasaka and up towards the Turkish border, that considers themselves to be part of a broader Kurdistan regional grouping. We tend to regard the Kurds as being relatively benign because they're not actively engaged in conflict against the West. But the Kurdish national project is at least as geopolitically destabilizing in terms of Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, as many of the other things that are going on in the region. This is not to suggest that the Kurds are a threat. It's to say, success in one part of the problem tends to track with failure in another. The other big geopolitical issue, of course, that is implicit in your question is the Russians. So that we now have what Medvedev at the Munich conference described as a new Cold War. When we saw, the Russians intervene last September in Syria, that was the culmination of a long period of developments, including a feeling by the Russians that they'd been betrayed over us over Libya by us in 2011. Then a belief in August of 2013 that around the time of the Ghouta chemical attacks in Syria, that nothing that they would want to do in the region would result in a pushback from the US or the West. And you see this kind of continuous line from really the UNSCR 1973 decision, the decision to go into Libya in March, April of 2011, up through the invasion of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea, the start of the war in Ukraine, and then the sort of expansion of Russian footprint across the region. And I think that really underlines the fact that players in the Middle East now have multiple choices, one of which is the Russians, and another is the Iranians, for people that they may want to turn to. And that, again, massively complicates the challenge.
And do you think it's fair to say that in this geopolitical context, the Americans are effectively sort of absent from the game, or can we expect to see a more visible U.S. engagement?
I think there's really no prospect that the U.S. is going to engage in a fundamental shift in its strategic approach between now and the end of this administration. There's been many opportunities for that to happen, and the Obama administration hasn't taken them for a variety of reasons. I don't mean that as a criticism of President Obama, but I don't think you're going to see a significant shift between now and the beginning of 2017 when a new administration comes in. And right now, if you're a betting man, you would suggest that it's going to be either a Trump or a Clinton administration, each of which are going to have significant challenges, frankly. I think the challenges around a Trump administration are reasonably obvious. The challenges around a Clinton administration are associated with the fact that the Russians largely blame what happened in Libya on Hillary Clinton because of some discussions that happened around in the UN before the intervention in Libya. So I think whoever becomes the new president in January of 2017, he or she is going to be dealing with a much more difficult situation than we're seeing now. And partly around the sets of issues that we've talked about, but also around, I think, what we're likely to see in Afghanistan this year, which is likely, in fact, to go back significantly in security terms.
Perhaps you could say a bit more about Afghanistan, because it's not exactly irrelevant.
Afghanistan hasn't been front and center in a lot of the discussions about the Islamic State. Islamic State first began to emerge in Afghanistan at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, actually as a result of a leadership split within the Pakistani Taliban. But we've seen since then a really substantial expansion of ISIS presence in the south and the east of Afghanistan. Last September, around the period when the Taliban seized the northern provincial capital of Kunduz, the ISIS group in Afghanistan actually launched an attack on 10 government posts in Nangarhar, the far eastern province of Afghanistan. And I think in many ways, actually, the rise of ISIS in Afghanistan is at least as dangerous for the Taliban as it is for Kabul, because it actually undermines their long-term strategy, which is basically waiting for us to leave and then emerging to engage in a power-sharing discussion with Kabul. Now they've got this much more radical, much more aggressive group emerging on the flank that's actually threatening that strategy. But if you are sitting in Kabul, it's a pretty shaky situation to be in. We got the Afghans, I think, to and frankly the Afghans got themselves to a very capable situation in terms of ground combat, improved policing, improved governance on the ground, and a number of other improvements. But they're still very reliant on the West for air support, intelligence, logistics and maintenance, which are exactly the same kinds of things that we are incredibly short supply now because of what we're doing in Iraq and in Syria. And in the last two fighting seasons, the Afghans have actually done rather well against the Taliban, but their loss rate is too high to be sustainable over the long term. So I think we've got some serious long-term issues in Afghanistan even before ISIS turned up. Now with ISIS emerging, I think that makes it much more critical than it otherwise would have been.
So what you're describing is something that kind of seems to drown the policy bandwidth of policymakers around the world, but particularly in the West.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I don't think that's an accident. I think my wife is a former Air Force pilot, and she describes it as task saturation. So many things are going on simultaneously in many of the same places that policymakers just don't have the bandwidth to decide what to do first and to decide how to prioritise resources. I think there are two policy things that play into that. One is, and I talk about both of these in the book, one of them is the decision to go away from the construct of the war on terrorism in 2009. I was not a fan of that construct. I thought that it was dramatically overbroad, and it created a whole series of challenges. And I talk about that in the book. But I was kind of disappointed in 2009 when we replaced that flawed concept with nothing, and came up with this idea of overseas contingency operations. And so, going back to the Russians, for the Russians, the Arctic, the Baltic, Ukraine, Crimea, Central Asia, Iraq and Syria are all different fronts of one strategic picture. For us, they're different conflicts in their own right, and we treat them differently. It's like trying to fight the Second World War while treating the Burma, New Guinea, North African and Greek campaigns as different wars in their own right, without sort of an overarching structure. And I think that's really contributed to the task saturation. Also, this is an obvious point, but in Iraq and Syria, you have two incumbents and two groups of insurgents. For the Russians and the Iranians, they're in favour of both incumbents against both lots of insurgents. For Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS, they're in favour of both lots of insurgents against both incumbents. We're the only major player that's in favour of one incumbent and against the other. So every time we help ourselves on one side of the frontier, we hurt ourselves on the other, and there's this strategic inconsistency. The other policy thing is again, something that I talk about in the book. President Bush's great management failures were mainly associated with delegating too much and letting people like Donald Rumsfeld and Doug Feith and Bremer and a bunch of other people do things that really the president should have been keeping a much closer eye on. And the big change in American policy happened at the end of 2005, beginning of 2006, and then particularly during the surge in Iraq, when the president essentially sidelined all these players and took control into his own hands.
Absolutely.
President Obama has maintained a lot of policy continuity with the second term of the Bush administration. And that's something that's not really talked about in the States, because for political reasons, Democrats and Republicans like to portray their policies as opposites, but actually the substance of policy has been very consistent for the last three presidential terms. President Obama has gone to the other extreme from President Bush and actually keeps in his own hands, and with a very small group of people, 3 or 4 people within the White House, a lot of decisions that would have been very heavily delegated in the Bush administration. And so what that does actually is creates a bit of a choke point where lots of decisions have to be made by the same 3 individuals, and there's only 24 hours in the day, and you exacerbate that bandwidth challenge.
Indeed, I have vivid memories of specific counterintelligence investigations being directed from the Oval Office.
Yes, that's right.
And as you say, it creates...
And the president approving individual drone strike targets
exactly.
and stuff. And you can argue whether we should be doing drone strikes at all, that's a great discussion. But certainly the president, with all the other things that he has to do, doesn't necessarily need to be spending half the day looking at them.
Okay, well, I mean, David, you very eloquently sort of sketched out the kind of problem that we're facing. So I guess the second half of this is to ask, what can be done, if indeed anything can be done, to if not turn this situation around, at least bring it down to more manageable proportions. And of course, that involves a number of things. It involves foreign governments being willing and able to develop and maintain consistent policies with clear objectives. It also means, obviously, the incumbents, in countries like Iraq being willing to, and Afghanistan, to pursue the kind of policies that might actually lower the temperature in these areas. I mean, what do you think should be done, and what do you think is the art of the possible in this?
So, and those are actually two very different statements, right? Let me just pick up something that you said last. I think we actually have, in Haider al-Abadi and his cabinet and many other players in Iraq, we have a much more inclusive government than we've had for really the last several years, and they are in fact trying to do the right thing. And I think that the political situation in Iraq is very, very dangerous, but is stable. It's no longer trending negatively as it was in the last few years. The military situation in Iraq is actually getting slightly better, and has been for about 3.5 months. And we may start to see it improve a little bit more. The problem in Iraq is not that. It's that there is no Iraq anymore. You know, it's sort of the soft partition has already happened, and it's a bit of a question whether even somebody like Haider al-Abadi can bring that back. I believe that Ayatollah al-Sistani is going to be a very important player here, as he has been many times during the conflict. Now, in Afghanistan, you also have a national unity government that's fairly technocratic, that has put a lot of effort into reducing corruption and improving governance, and is actually being relatively inclusive in terms of bringing in people that want to talk peace and try to stabilise the environment. So I think, you know, on that score, at least, we're in a much better position than we were a few years ago. But it's an obvious point. But if I'm right about Afghanistan, then Afghanistan in 2016 could end up looking a lot like Iraq in 2014. We could end up with a significant security collapse and the emergence of a major ISIS presence in Afghanistan. So it may be that everything that's happened so far since the fall of Mosul is just the first shoe dropping, and that there's actually another whole set of things that are about to happen. The second big thing that I think, you know, we mentioned the migrant crisis, that's going to keep rolling. And I think that what's about to happen in Libya, is already happening in Libya, is going to only exacerbate that and will probably have a significant knock-on effect for the rest of North Africa and the Sahel. So I think it could in fact get a lot worse before it stabilises. So with that caveat in mind, I think, you know, if you accept the broad structure of the threat as being a state-like threat that is mainly geopolitical in the Middle East, a regional terrorism threat, and then this sort of domestic counter-terrorism problem, the solution sets are relatively obvious, although doing them is pretty difficult. So, you know, we need to make peace in Syria. We need to help the Iraqis continue to roll ISIS back. That is not going to result in a short-term drop in terrorism risk in the West. If anything, it'll be create a spike in terrorism risk. And so then there's a regional issue of working with regional partners that are confronting ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. That's the hard bit. We successfully took down the core group of Al-Qaeda in about an 18-month period between 2003 and 2005. But it's a 10-year or a 20-year effort to get a partner from a powerless governance or from an oppressive military or a corrupt police force to the stage where they can actually deal with these threats on their own. So I think that's what's going to take a lot longer and a lot more effort. And then domestically, I think certainly in UK, US and Australia, the authorities, you know, the legal requirements and the capacities are all basically there. But I think that there's a public debate to have about how much we want to give up on civil liberties and engage in mass surveillance to deal with a threat that's much more amorphous now. And the risk is that, in fact, we end up destroying the things that make it worth living in these societies in the first place. So I think my end point would be we have to recognise this is the new normal. The idea that we're going to somehow go back to a pre-9/11 environment is a fantasy. You know, for a start, the pre-9/11 environment didn't work for a lot of people globally. That's why there was a 9/11, right? But also, this level of threat is here to stay. And so I think there's a debate to have now about what I would describe more as societal resiliency. You know, how do we handle what's likely to be a sustained, elevated terrorism threat without engaging in the kinds of measures that would actually, you know, turn ourselves into police states.
Yeah. And of course, you know, herein lies the problem, because at a conceptual level, I think a lot of policymakers, indeed, I think a lot of ordinary citizens would be comfortable with the prospect that this struggle is a generational struggle. We've heard this said, you know, by many different people in many different contexts. But operationalizing that, you know, in democracies where incoming governments seek to differentiate themselves from their predecessors by policy shifts and promising that things will be better, there will be fewer, you know, overseas military deployments, etc. You know, is you know, a very tempting prospect.
Yeah.
Realistically, do you think that the West collectively can arrive at a situation where it is possible to, you know, evolve and sustain workable strategies long enough to actually, you know, deliver results, because this is exactly what didn't happen in Iraq, exactly what
Right.
is not happening in Afghanistan. We pulled the plug too early.
Right.
And
Well,
actually advertised the fact that we were going to do so the bad guys could plan and organise.
right. I mean, so I should say I've been fairly critical of both the Bush and the Obama administrations in the book. Not sort of patting myself on the back and throwing rocks at other people, because I was one of the key, counterterrorism planners. So it's a self-confession of failure, But I think we want to recognise that, that there is a fairly high degree of continuity, in fact, over the past 10 years or so, 10 to 12 years of US counterterrorism strategy that is, in fact, bipartisan. The rhetoric is not, but the actions have been largely bipartisan. I think in the UK too, there's a sort of surface disagreement about some of particularly the rhetoric and the way that we're engaging, but the substance has been relatively steady. So I think actually it is possible to come up with a sort of lowest common denominator agreed position on these kinds of threats in places like the UK and the US. I think continental Europe is a different matter, and we could see some significant instability in the next year or two on that front. But I think it is possible. But I go back to something you said about it being a generational conflict. In December 2012, I was in a place called Dayak, which is southeastern Afghanistan, in a tiny little Navy SEAL outpost. It was getting attacked every night, and they'd been out there for, 12 months. And I spent some time working with this particular team to get them back on track of what they were doing. As I was leaving to fly out of there was a Navy radio operator on the LZ, the aircraft takes off from. The kid looked about 12. And I said to him, how old are you, mate? And he said, I'm 19 years old. So this is December 2012. So that guy was in 3rd or 4th grade at primary school on 9/11. And, he's graduated from primary school, graduated from secondary school, joined the military, become a Navy SEAL, deployed to Afghanistan. That kid's probably now on his 2nd or 3rd deployment. And there's guys on their sort of 12th or 14th deployment.
Yeah.
So I think, we have to recognise that, yes, it's generational, but to the extent that we're allowing a relatively small professional military caste to carry that burden, then I think it's less sustainable than if we try to involve the rest of the community in a discussion about what we think is achievable.
Less sustainable or less unsustainable?
Sorry, it's less unsustainable if we get everybody in the discussion.
Indeed. So by professionalising it, it kind of, But of course, part of the problem with that, and we saw this in the UK with the Afghan campaign in particular, is that we started with a situation in which the public were disenchanted with the British Armed Forces and disenchanted with the campaign they were fighting. We turned it round to the point where they were supportive of their armed forces, but not supportive of the conflict.
Right.
So getting that degree of public buy-in for the long term, I think, still does matter, and not an easy thing to do.
Well, and indeed, if you think about that 3-level threat that I've talked about, the role of conventional militaries in dealing with that is relatively limited. I mean, there is a role at the top layer, and there's certainly a role for special operations forces in advising locally. But we're not talking about divisions and corps of people. We're talking about a few hundred guys. I think there's some thinking to be done about what is the role of the military, and how does it interact with other services.
And perhaps I'll make this the last question before opening this up. There was a period between maybe the end of middle to end of 2006, and certainly the demise of Osama bin Laden, where we seemed to have kind of we seemed to be hitting a sweet spot, and this was all about special forces raids, drone strikes, intelligence-led activity. Targeting the decapitation operations as they came to be known. Do you think that we collectively put too much faith in and too much weight on that kind of operation?
Yes, and in fact I talk about this in detail in the book. We achieved a very significant measure of success temporarily in Iraq, primarily because for the one and only time in the war on terrorism today, temporarily we had a high degree of leadership attention on the problem, and our ends, ways, and means were aligned, right? So the goals we were trying to achieve and the resources we were putting against those goals were roughly equal. For most of the rest of the period since 9/11, we've had these incredibly expansive goals, and we've allocated ridiculously small resources for the kinds of goals that we're trying to achieve. And I'm not suggesting that we need to put in large amounts of additional resources. We need to decide if these are the resources we have, we need to change the goals. And if we don't want to change the goals, we need to put in some more resources. And I think that was really that created a window of opportunity for us to transition to this light footprint approach. And I think the light footprint approach has been shown to be problematic, and I think the reason is one of sequencing. We were very effective at decapitating the leadership groups of Al-Qaeda Central through that light footprint strategy. What that did was to create a vacuum at the senior level of Al-Qaeda. We were not as effective in helping partners to deal with the regional franchises, and so the regional franchises grew into that vacuum. One of those regional franchises was ISIS, but it wasn't the only one. AQIM, AQAP, so North Africa and Yemen were two other regional groups that grew to have a global focus because we created that vacuum and they grew into it. The other thing I think that happened through the light footprint approach was kind of an exoticizing and alienizing of Muslims in Western societies. And I'm deliberately not using the term Muslim community because certainly in Australia there is no Muslim community. There's many different communities, they're not all the same, and we sort of said, well, we have to treat these people with kid gloves and appoint sort of intermediaries to deal with that. And I think that was all part of the same idea of sort of trying to keep everything at one remove. And I think that we're, not so much in the UK, but certainly in France and Belgium and Germany, we're dealing now with the effects of that alienization of the population. So yeah, lots of points that are covered, but I mean, as we said, it's a fairly complex set of issues.
Yeah, I mean, it is a huge topic, and certainly having just read your latest book, Blood Year, I would certainly encourage anyone here. This is not a book launch, formally speaking, but I would certainly encourage anyone who's interested in the topic to read it. So. With that, I mean, we could carry on talking forever, and indeed we spent about an hour talking non-stop before we got up here. So I think probably a good moment for us to stop talking to each other and talk to you. So can I invite questions? Are we going to have microphone? Yes, the lady in the fourth row back there. Yeah, thank you. If you can just be patient, the microphone will come. And can I just ask you to please identify yourself before you make a question? Thank you.
I'm Kimiko Rufeiras from the New York Times. Could you talk a little bit about the spread of the Islamic State to Africa? They have a presence in Libya. We're seeing terrorist attacks by Boko Haram and AQIM, and Boko Haram has pledged allegiance to ISIS. I'm not sure how strong that allegiance is, but I mean, what are the aims? What are its aims in Africa, if it has any? And could African governments be relied on to contain their spread? Thank you.
So 3 different areas where we've seen significant ISIS growth in the last 18 months or so. North Africa, East Africa, and West Africa, and the dynamics are actually different in each of them. So in North Africa, you've got formally declared ISIS wilayat, actually a number of them, in Libya. You've got a group in Tunisia that's very strong in southeastern Tunisia that was responsible for the Susa attack, which killed 30 British tourists last year. You've got significant expansion of ISIS networks into Morocco and Algeria, and that's largely, I think, a result of the negative effects of firstly the Libyan war, and then the collapse of the Libyan state in 2013. And that's actually a very good illustration of the weakness of the light footprint approach, because it was in fact a US raid into Tripoli in 2013 that triggered the collapse of the Zaidan government and led to the splitting of the country into 2 rival blocks and created the space for ISIS to build a wilayat in Sirte, which, if you know, Libya is right in the middle of these 2 blocks, right? So, and then further south in Libya, in Fezzan, which is a very remote desert area, another group has grown, and that's now expanding across several regional boundaries. So that's sort of North Africa. So I would say that's a pre-existing set of challenges that's been exacerbated by Libya. West Africa, it's basically growing by acquisition. So Boko Haram comes out of specifically Nigerian issues that go back 20 years or more, but with its sort of accession to be Islamic State West Africa, it's signed on to the brand name and to a particular set of goals that, frankly, I don't see as particularly Nigerian. You know, they're just it's tapping into a broader network. It's also gone regional into Cameroon and to other parts of its own region. So I think that's a different set of dynamics that largely have to do with, frankly, the decolonization of Nigeria and things that happened in the structure of that led to the rise of Boko Haram. In East Africa, just recently, 4 weeks ago, about 300 al-Shabaab fighters defected from al-Shabaab, which is still very active, but is al-Qaeda aligned to ISIS. And I think what you're seeing there is something that you see in a lot of places, not just in East Africa, which is that the rise of the Islamic State has offered a new model for pre-existing guerrilla and terrorist groups, and it's also kind of reinvigorated the jihad that was to some extent flagging, as Nigel said earlier, and it's almost like a growth by competition. So we saw Shabab actually consciously copying ISIS propaganda and kinetic techniques over the last couple of years. Now we actually have significant numbers of people joining ISIS in East Africa. So, you know, that's Africa. It's complex. As the Americans joke, you know, Africa, it's a big country, you know. I mean, there's 55 countries in Africa now, you know, 1 billion people. It's a very diverse set of challenges. But I think the Islamic State's having a bit of a sort of surface unifying effect on that. And of course, because it's so diverse, the ability of countries to deal with it is also very diverse. But I don't see any African country that's in a position where it can deal with that threat on its own.
Okay, in the second row, thinking there.
Nicholas McLean, how uniform is the Sunni Islamic ideology of Daesh around the world?
Well, it's not particularly uniform even at the central level of the Islamic State. You have a significant former Ba'ath regime group who are often described as secular. They're not. They're Salafized Ba'ath military, people that came up through the Al-Hamla al-Imaniyya, the faith campaign that Ibrahim Izzat al-Duri put in place after 1991. So just because they're Ba'athists doesn't mean that they're not also Salafi. Yeah. But you do also have a sort of very aggressive cadre of people that have a very apocalyptic worldview that are trying to generate, almost provoke a Western intervention and then exploit that. A lot of people are reading the ISIS magazine, Dabiq, you know, and deciding that what ISIS is trying to do is to lure us into a big battle in the Middle East. I would caution you against that. You know, that's like trying to figure out the corporate strategy of a major airline by reading the in-flight magazine. You know, it's public discourse that's designed to put forward a particular point of view. If you look at what these guys are saying to each other, the strategy is laid out in things like the management of savagery. There's a couple of other documents that I think are worth looking at. That it's very geopolitical in its approach, and I think that the ISIS strategy is much more conventional than it is terrorist. It's about carving out a territorial state that governs like a state, and then expanding it by relatively conventional territorial conquest. And the role of the wilayats is to act as almost territorial bridgeheads to enable that expansion. The model that we tend to look back to is Al-Qaeda. The model these guys are looking back to is 7th century, you know, conventional conquest. And I think that does give you a slightly different set of ideas. There's the place that's experiencing the most ferment right now is Southeast Asia, where Jamaat Islamiyah, which is the Al-Qaeda ally, has actually split now into several different groups that are actually opposed to each other, some backing the old JI, some representing a new third way, and others going with Islamic State. And if you notice that Filipinos killed 42 members of Ansar al-Sharia, which is a JI-affiliated IS clone in the Philippines on the weekend. So that's a much more diverse set of challenges than we see in many other places.
Okay, gentlemen in the front row, and then third row there. I'll take them in that order, please.
Tom Fenton, a member of the Institute. Is there, talking about North Africa, is there a particular near-term threat posed by Algeria because it has an ailing, barely functional leader clinging to power, and it's so overwhelmingly dependent on oil, it's danger of running out of money. And it has another problem of terrorism, of course.
Yeah, well, I think certainly there's an Algerian connection to a lot of what we see in Tunisia and in Morocco, for obvious reasons, but also more broadly in the continent. And as you're probably aware, a lot of the French terrorist groups, like the Bout Chaumont group that was involved in the Charlie Hebdo attack, and possibly some of the guys that were involved in the November attack, had connections to Algerian terrorists that had been operating in France. So there's certainly there's that sort of underlying connection. But the broader point about oil, I think, is critically important. When we're now looking at sustained low global oil prices for the foreseeable future. And that has massively negative effects on ISIS, right? I mean, they've had to cut their fighters' pay in half in the last couple of months because they don't have so much oil revenue coming in. But it has massively negative effects on the Kurds and on the Iraqis and, and on many North African countries. That's partly, again, why the ISIS wilayat in Libya is such a problem, because they're now acquiring access to significant oil reserves in Libya, as they already have in Iraq and Syria. So, I think if I were going to project how bad can it get, how good can it get, just what are the parameters of this going forward, I think it's quite likely that we're going to see Algeria struggle, as many other North African countries are going to struggle, to pay for the social spending and the security effort that they need to contain the threat. Now, that is also going to affect ISIS. It's also going to suffer from low prices. But I think ISIS is in a rather strong position compared to the states in the region now, because it has that kind of central block of territory and can strike in a number of directions.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, the gentleman in the third row there. So, can you keep your hand up? Yeah, thanks.
Hello. Thanks for that, David. That was a brilliant chat. I'm Nicholas Beecroft from the Royal College of Defence Studies. Ever since 9/11, I'm a psychiatrist, by the way. I've been looking at the psychology of the West with the perspective that we focus on the narrative of Al-Qaeda or Islamic State and so on. How are they thinking and so on. And I found that when we turn the camera back on ourselves, as in who are we, the West, the first question is often, well, who are we? And we're a bit of a postmodern blancmange and a sort of a materialist emptiness with nothing in the centre. And so I'd be really, my view is that we do need a clear narrative, who we are, what our values are, what's true, what's right and wrong, what gives us confidence. Why should people join us? Why should our people fight? Why should we have a strong belief in the future, etc.? So I'd be really fascinated to hear your version of that. Who are we? Where are we going? Why are we fighting?
What are we fighting for? Yeah. So that's a great. It's a great point to bring up. I'm not sure I have an answer to the question. Let me draw a contrast with the Russians, right? We have intervened in Syria against the Islamic State. The Russians have intervened in Syria in favor of the Assad regime. There's a fundamentally different approach that's implied by those two statements. What we're trying to do is to take down a particular threat actor, and so we focused on kinetic strikes and intelligence work and so on, and we target a fairly narrow band through the middle of Syria. The Russians are there to support a client partner with whatever it takes, and the reason, about a third of their strikes have gone in against ISIS since they intervened. 2/3 of them have been against other groups, primarily because it's mainly other groups that threaten the Assad regime, not ISIS. So I think you can see that it's a more organized. You're able to come up with a more organized strategy if you're very clear on what you're intervening to support. Now, I think for most Western counterterrorism strategists in the early period of the war on terrorism, the implied and sometimes explicit answer to that question is that we were trying to preserve the state system as it had existed since the end of the Cold War, against this very corrosive threat that was undermining societies from within and creating a dynamic period of change. Two problems with that. One, Western corporations, international media, the explosion of electronic connectivity since the year 2000 is arguably doing as much to undermine the traditional state system as anything that Al-Qaeda's done. So we ourselves are part of the move beyond the traditional nation-state structure that we have been used to. Secondly, the responsibility to protect language that came into UN thinking in the late 1990s and has since become fairly standardized also undermines state sovereignty. And just read Putin's Valdai speech from October 2014, and he explicitly calls that out. In fact, you don't even need to go that far back. His statement in the UN General Assembly last year, he calls that out as one of the issues of where we ourselves have undermined the state system that we're trying to protect. The third one, and this is fundamental, is the invasion of Iraq. And I describe the invasion in the book as the greatest strategic screw-up since Hitler's invasion of Russia. And partly it is just a strategic screw-up, right, in that we turned a one-front war that we weren't winning into a massively difficult two-front war. But it also is something that goes fundamentally against the kinds of points of view that we want to associate ourselves with as part of our ideology, right? I mean, you saw this when John Kerry said after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, well, it's the 21st century. You can't just go in and overthrow countries and take them over. Like, hang on, mate. Have you been watching what's been happening since 2001? Like, and you might be a Democrat, and that happened under a Republican administration, but it's still the West, right? And I think we've got a really significant, what I might call moral integrity challenge at the heart of what we're trying to do. And now, guys like me, I'm a security guy, right? I'm a professional soldier, intelligence officer. I'm not the guy to answer that question. That's why I say it has to be a national debate in which people sign up for a conversation and the country comes to a consensus view on what it's willing to support going forward. And people whose livelihood derives from security measures against terrorism shouldn't be in that debate, right? It should be, probably not professional military either.
Indeed. Okay. Yes, the fourth row there, please. Yeah. Third row back. Yeah, that there. Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Claude Cochin, BE, Asset Management. The refugee crisis is obviously the result of terrorized people leaving. To which extent is it exploited as a political tool by ISIS?
So I want to make this explicit. At this point, Assad has killed 9.5 times as many people as ISIS. People that are fleeing from Iraq and Syria are not necessarily directly fleeing ISIS. What we saw in 2015 was the confluence of a number of factors simultaneously in the middle of the year. One of them was, frankly, just a procedural change in Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, around transit visas, right, which suddenly made it much easier for people to make the move into Macedonia and go to the rest of Europe, and that triggered a lot of people to move. But secondly, a lot of the people that went to Europe in 2015 were not coming directly from Iraq or Syria. They were people who had already been displaced up to 3 years previously and had been living in refugee camps in Turkey and in many cases in Libya and in other places in the region, and had suddenly, had gradually gotten to the point where they felt there was no prospect of returning to their home country, and the places where they were living were running out of resources to sustain them, and they felt like they just needed to make a move. The third thing was that Assad, in May of 2015, put out a much more aggressive conscription campaign as his regime suffered a big loss of territory in the summer of 2015. In the Battle of Palmyra at the end of May 2015, the regime abandoned more than 1,000 conscripts to be beheaded by ISIS as the town was captured. And so many military-age men in Syria saw that happen, got the summons to be conscripted and said basically no, and decided to vote with their feet. When those guys hit the refugee camps in the region, that triggered a knock-on effect and many more people fled. So I think it was a complex sort of multifactorial set of issues. But I think the most important thing to recognize is that it's going to have some very significant destabilizing effects in Europe. One of two things is going to happen. Either the continent will fail to absorb what is likely to be 3 million new people in the next 2 years, and you're going to have significant mainstream or right-wing or left-wing backlash against that presence, and an increase in domestic unrest and the kinds of concerns that we've seen in Germany and elsewhere. The other option is that it will successfully absorb 3 million people, and then you're going to have a short-term problem of the European welfare state and a lot of the expectations of communities not being able to be met with this influx of people who by definition are unemployed, or you're going to have a significant change in the frankly the geopolitical and religious orientation of Europe over the next couple of decades that could significantly shift a lot of the alliance politics that we've dealt with. So I say that without any value judgment. I'm just saying it as a strategist. We have to be thinking about a short, medium and long-term impact of that refugee movement that's not likely to be done with in the next year or two. It's going to last a decade or more.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, a number of hands going up. The gentleman at the back row there, the back row. Yeah, thank you.
Chris Hoekstra from University College London. You discussed briefly some of the issues around special operations forces and direct action. Could you comment on U.S. policy in the area of indirect action, whether it's a forecast or an assessment? Thank you.
What do you mean by indirect action?
Advisory, advise and assist in correlation with the Islamic State.
Well, yeah. I mean, the U.S. has put a huge amount of effort into improving what I would call security force assistance, which is a subset of indirect action, and things like the regionally aligned force, the way that which is basically organising the regular military in a way that it focuses on returning to the same areas over and over again. A lot of effort that's gone into establishing persistent presence rather than sort of episodic visits on the ground has made a significant difference. Also, I think people are now building on relationships that were built up after the beginning of the war on terrorism and are now fairly well established. So there are good military-to-military and civil-to-military relations. What's missing, I think, is the civilian piece of the puzzle. And again, one of the things I say in the book is I don't think that the US military in particular, or Western militaries in general, have a problem in doing counterinsurgency or counterterrorism. I think Western nations have a problem in translating battlefield success into sustainable political stability. And you could turn the military inside out, spend a lot more money or a lot less money, reorganize it. You're not going to fix that problem because it's not fundamentally a military problem. So I think we need to be thinking about what foreign officers and aid agencies and political leadership do and how that meshes with what we're doing with the military side of it. And to put it at its most crudely, if we get the military piece right, but we don't get the rest of it right, you run the risk of teaching oppressive militaries to shoot straight and helping corrupt police be better at being corrupt police. And we need to be focusing, I think, much more on the reform piece and the societal change that needs to happen to prevent a recurrence of this.
Okay, the second row from the back there, yes. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Good evening, sir. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. My name is Atreya. I'm a consultant. You talked a lot about Southeast Asia, and you made a passing reference to Afghanistan and Pakistan. Would it be possible for you to throw some light on the possible effect of ISIS on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the larger South Asian region? Because that's home to a large number of Muslims. All the countries, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, all have a large Muslim population. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bangladesh is a slightly different issue, so I'm going to set that aside for a minute. So ISIS in Afghanistan has been adopted as a wilayat by the central state in Iraq and Syria, but it actually comes from a leadership split in the Pakistani Taliban that happened in 2013, where a transition of leadership left a number of people, about 5 major leaders, feeling alienated, and they carved out their own group. And then in the aftermath of the school attack and the very large-scale, actually quite successful Pakistani military offensive against the Pakistani Taliban, some of them were pushed into Afghanistan and they began to organize in eastern Afghanistan. I said, I think in passing, that I think that the rise of ISIS is more of a threat to the Taliban than it is to Kabul, and I think that's the key to understanding this. December 2009, President Obama announced the surge into Afghanistan, but also stated the date for withdrawal, which was at that time was to begin in July of 2011. I happened to be meeting with some pro-Taliban emissaries the night that the announcement came out, and they said to me, "Look, what are you doing? Are you trying to lose?" They said, "You guys, you just told everyone when you're leaving. We're going to go out on the street tomorrow and we're going to say to Afghans, you might like the Americans or you might not like them, but they're leaving in July. What are you doing in August? Because we'll still be here." And that's exactly what they did. They went straight out, as everyone knows, and did that. More importantly, they ran a strategy which I would call an economy of force strategy. So they kept the main force in Pakistan or out of combat in parts of Afghanistan. They did just enough with guerrilla groups inside Afghanistan to maintain themselves in the public eye and keep some political leverage. And then they just waited the clock out, and we very helpfully told them exactly how long they had to wait. So when we pulled out and the final transition to Operation Resolute Support happened at the end of 2014, the Afghan Taliban strategy was, okay, the Westerners have gone, now it's time for us to begin going back in. And from really 2014 onward, we saw columns of literally hundreds of Taliban running around in areas where we were only seeing a couple of guys, a year before that. And we saw the Kunduz attack, but also significant offensives in Helmand and in Kandahar and in the east. And it was basically the Taliban coming back in, not to recapture Afghanistan, but to put themselves in a strong enough position to negotiate a power-sharing deal with Kabul that would give them a substantial role in the post-ISAF Afghanistan. Now ISIS has emerged. They are in no way interested in negotiating with Kabul. They don't want to create a power-sharing agreement. They want to create, an Islamic State. And so that's actually a very significant threat to the Taliban strategy. They actually now have a closing window of opportunity to make peace with Kabul. If they don't do that, it's quite likely that they're going to get eaten from behind by this emerging movement out of Pakistan. So actually that gives me some hope that in the talks that are about to begin, the Kabul government and the Taliban will see they actually have a common goal here in trying to stabilize the environment. Bangladesh's a different issue, but we can come back to that later if you want to.
Okay. Right. I think I'll have to run this down, but to take one question there, and if I can't accommodate everybody, I apologize. Please.
Good evening. Matteo Souza, MA Strategic Studies, University of Reading. My question is related to the U.S. government position towards the Assad regime. I think in your book you said a lot of the Obama position that's saying that the Assad days are numbered, or the shifting from the red lines as well. Is this position, there's no concrete position towards the U.S. or the Obama administration to the Assad regime, can undermine the efforts towards the population in Syria, and towards this, is that bad with Assad and could be worse without him? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the US position has been, and I go through this in detail in the book, so I won't go through it again, but I think early in the war, President Obama just assumed that Assad was going to fall over, along with other people in the Arab Spring period. That obviously didn't happen for a variety of reasons that we can get into. Then the red line was again an assumption that Assad would be smart enough not to provoke the West. That was a misreading of Assad's interests. In fact, the generals were the ones who launched the Ghouta attack, not Assad. Assad's response was horror at the possibility that this was going to bring the West down like a ton of bricks on the regime. When that didn't happen, he and the Russians and others thought, oh, okay, we actually have a lot more freedom of action than we thought we had. And that changed the Assad regime's approach significantly. Right now, the Western position remains that there needs to be a transition to a new order in Syria, that the people that have to make that decision are the Syrian people, and that Assad needs to step down at the beginning of that process. The Russian and Iranian position is essentially identical, except for Assad, the man, not having to step down at the beginning. And if you talk to Syrian peace activists, many of them will say, Assad needs to go, the family needs to go, but the government needs to stay, otherwise, and be part of that transitional process. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos. Now, again, it's not for us to say what that process should be, but from a diplomatic standpoint, those negotiation positions are not that far apart, right? And the Russians don't have a personal commitment to Assad. What they have is a geopolitical commitment to their position in Syria. And Assad, the man, doesn't necessarily have to be there for them to get what they want. But I want to, if that sounds positive, I think I need to, I owe you a more negative response. Let's imagine that through some magic tonight, we reached a peace deal, and that the Russians, the Iranians, the Americans, everybody else were able to actually pull off some kind of peace deal tonight. There's 11 million displaced people in Syria. Half the population depends on international food aid to survive. More than half the cities are destroyed. We're looking at a 10 to 20 year minimum rebuilding and stabilization process to even get Syria back to a modicum of functionality, let alone to reconstruct it from the damage that it suffered. That's probably going to require a force of several 100,000 regional, UN or Western peacekeepers to make that work. And we're talking about an environment where you've got 20 to 30,000 ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra fighters who are not in the peace discussion, who are still out there with tanks and heavy weapons. So it would, even in the best possible circumstances, it might only be a matter of months before the stabilization in a post-peace deal Syria starts to look a hell of a lot like the war in Iraq. So I'm afraid we're not out of the woods by any means, even if we were able to make peace in Syria.
Okay, David, I'm afraid on that note I'm going to have to draw things to a close because we are out of time, but I'd just like to say thanks very much. I can't think of many speakers who can address this topic with the breadth and depth, command of detail and strategic perspective that you've been able to bring to bear. It's been an extremely educative and informative experience, and I'd like to invite all of you to join me in thanking David.
Thank you.